Hello and welcome to my channel and another video in my Death Row Dinners series. For this one, you are going to want to sit down and make yourself comfortable, maybe even grab a snack because this one is going to be a long one. A takeaway has been ordered and I'm just waiting for it to arrive. And then I'll tell you about the life and death of Barbara Graham. For her last meal, Barbara Graham requested a chocolate milkshake and a chocolate sundae. So I have ordered the same things from my favourite dessert takeaway, Sunday Sesh at Emmanuel's. Now, I am not as big a fan of chocolate flavoured things as Barbara, so I've cheated slightly with the sundae because it didn't specify exactly what components went into the sundae. So I've gone for 2 scoops of chocolate fudge brownie ice cream, 1 scoop of white chocolate ice cream because it's still chocolate, topped with white chocolate shavings, and I have a feeling this could be very messy. And I may have to eat it quite quickly. Okay, yeah, it's all falling out. If the name Barbara Graham is familiar to you, it may be because there was a 1958 film made about her life called I Want to Live. The lead actress, Susan Hayward, was nominated for and won an Academy Award. I haven't seen this film, and indeed I hadn't heard of it or heard of Barbara until I started looking into this. Barbara Elaine Ford was born on June 26, 1923, in Oakland, California. Her teenage mother, Hortense Ford, was from Santa Cruz and was unmarried. Hortense relied on the sex industry to earn a living and survive, and Barbara was the eldest of 3 children. When Barbara was just 2 years old, her mother was sent to a reform school called the Ventura School for Girls, and Barbara's father was just completely absent from her life. Imagine being separated like that from your parents at the age of 2. By 1929, Hortense was 23 and she got married to a man named Joe Wood. And when she got married, she changed her name and the names of her children, which included Barbara, from Ford to Wood. I have to say, for someone who wouldn't have chocolate ice cream as a first choice, this is really delicious. It's very creamy and the brownie pieces in it are so soft and chewy. When Hortense was sent away, Barbara was inevitably swallowed up by the foster system. This saw her bouncing around from family to family, and in later life, Barbara alleged that she had actually been beaten and abused by many of her foster families. Unsurprisingly, this tumultuous start to her life meant that she had limited education. She was intelligent and she was pretty, but her mother, Hortense, would never let her forget that she was an illegitimate child. And Hortense often told Barbara that she would probably turn out bad. Barbara later told Bernice Freeman of the San Francisco Chronicle that
my mama never even cared if I lived or died, as long as I didn't bother her.
When she was 12, Barbara was adopted by a welfare worker who had been familiar with her case for several years. In December 1936, when Barbara was 13, her mother Hortense reported her to juvenile authorities. And in March of the following year, Barbara was labelled a wayward girl and made a ward of court on grounds of immorality. She was 14 at this point. 14, and Barbara herself admitted to having had several sexual partners already. I'm just going to give this milkshake a try. Just a chocolate milkshake with whipped cream, nothing fancy in it. You could get ones with chocolate bars and things in, but I don't think that's what Barbara would have had. Barbara was sent to the convent of the Good Shepherd. She escaped several times, and a teenage girl living in a convent, I can't blame her. I'm sure I would have been the same in her position. This, unfortunately for Barbara, led to her being arrested for vagrancy, and she was then sent to the same reform school that her mother had attended, the Ventura School for Girls. Barbara was not one to give up, and she continued to make multiple attempts to escape. She was noted as having an attitude and was known to strut around the corridors as if she owned the place. It was while she was here at the Ventura School for Girls that Barbara learnt to develop a tough exterior and attitude. And she also learned how to fight back. 16-year-old Barbara was released in 1939 but remained on parole until 1942, at which point she was discharged because she was apparently just impossible to supervise. With her questionable background and lack of education, it was pretty much impossible for Barbara to secure any kind of job. So she did the only thing she could think of, which was to use her good looks to her advantage, and she began working as a seagull. Seagulls were women who dated sailors, and dating meant dating. Sometimes there might be a bit more than just dating involved, but it wasn't a given. Barbara did not want her path to go the same way that her mother's had. She wanted better for herself, and she really did try. She managed to get herself enrolled in business college, and she married a man named Harry Keelhammer. He would be the first of her 4 husbands. Barbara was 17 and she fell pregnant by Harry, and the two of them then decided to get married. Barbara did not want her child to be illegitimate. Barbara and Harry actually had 2 sons together, but Barbara had told him absolutely nothing about her past. With 2 young mouths to feed, money was really tight for the couple, and this led to quite a lot of arguments. In 1942, Harry learned the details of Barbara's past, and to say he was shocked would probably have been an understatement. They decided that they would get a divorce, and Harry was eventually granted custody of both boys, which at that time was pretty unusual. During her marriage to Harry, Barbara was arrested a number of times on counts of disruptive behaviour and suspicion of prostitution. With her home life in tatters, the loss of her 2 sons, the breakup of her marriage, Barbara turned to the only thing she knew. But this time, she did go fully into prostitution. She told reporter Bernice Freeman, "Sure, I was a prostitute, and a damn good one. If you need sleep, you sleep. If you want sex, why not get it? What's the difference?" During World War II is when she again was working as a seagull, and she was hanging around naval bases fraternising with the men who worked there. She started out working at the Oakland Army and Naval bases, and the Alameda Air Station. Then she moved to Long Beach, California and San Diego. She was arrested again several times in all of these different areas on counts of prostitution, but she would plead guilty and pay a fine and be allowed to go on her way. I may well mispronounce this name, and if that happens, I'm very sorry. It's my best guess. But in 1944, Barbara married husband number 2. His name was Alois Puchel. At least, that's what I think his name was. It's probably pronounced very differently. This marriage only lasted for 4 months, and then Puchel filed for an annulment. With failed marriage number 2 behind her, Barbara made her way back to San Francisco, and there she embarked upon a career as a mid-class call girl. She did pretty well for herself in that line of work and began working for a well-known madam, Sally Stanford. As a good-looking woman with striking hair and natural sex appeal, Barbara was very popular. She became acquainted with many men who were involved in drugs, gambling, and other illicit and illegal endeavours. In 1947, Barbara was actually convicted of perjury after providing a false alibi. 2 men, Mark Monroe and Thomas Sittler, had been charged with assault and the intent to commit robbery. This saw Barbara sentenced to 5 years at the California Department of Corrections Women's State Prison at Tehachapi. Yes, I am reading that from my script because I cannot memorize that. But she was able to negotiate this down to 1 year in jail and then 5 years, which she would serve on parole. Barbara was released in 1949 and wasted absolutely no time in violating her parole by moving to Reno, Nevada, without informing her parole officer. She spent some time there working in a hospital as a nurse's aide. No experience was required and training would be provided. So again, this gave Barbara a chance to meet people who were not involved in any sort of criminality. It really was a fresh start for her. Before long, she began dating a salesman named Charles Newman, and he became husband number 3. Once married, Barbara left her position at the hospital for a job working as a waitress. However, the hours were long and the work was hard, as I'm sure anyone who has worked in the hospitality industry will know. I myself have not, but I have friends who have. As well as this, Barbara was also expected to fulfill the role of housewife. It all became way too much for her to handle, and she packed a bag and she left. Barbara was enticed back to the comparative glamour of California and Los Angeles, and she returned to her old line of work. And this was where she met husband number 4, who would be her final husband, Henry Graham. Henry was a bartender and their relationship was a tempestuous one. Henry introduced Barbara to various narcotics. They would frequently argue about money, and they were one of these couples on a constant merry-go-round of breaking up and making up. They made up long enough to be able to have a son in 1952, and he was named Tommy. Barbara was introduced to numerous shady friends of Henry's, and 2 of these men were named Jack Santos and Emmett Perkins. These 2 men ran illegal poker games, and they were keen to employ Barbara because she could entice her customers to come and play a few rounds before going back with her to her room. After the birth of Tommy, Henry really struggled to hold down a job. He had moved on to harder drugs. He also felt Barbara was earning a good enough wage as a prostitute. What a lovely, lovely man. Barbara was 28, and this put an enormous amount of stress on her. When it all began to get a bit too much, Barbara would ask Henry for just a little bit of heroin to help take the edge off. Barbara was convinced she could stay in control. But of course, it wasn't long before she was just as addicted to heroin as her husband. Unsurprisingly, the relationship deteriorated, and Barbara embarked upon an affair with Emmett Perkins. It was through Emmett that Barbara heard of a wealthy widow, Mabel Monahan. Mabel Monahan was 64 years old. She had a daughter named Iris who had been married to a Las Vegas gambler named Luther Shearer. When Iris and Luther divorced, Iris moved to New York, and she gave the home she had shared with her former husband to her mother. This was located in Burbank. Despite the divorce, Mabel remained good friends with Luther. There were many rumours circulating about Mabel stashing money in her home, keeping it safe for Luther, so that if he was ever in a tight spot with gambling debts, he had a little something hidden away. These rumours had reached the ears of Santos and Perkins, and the prospect of an easy job with a large payout proved far too good to resist. Burbank was a pretty sleepy town, and they figured it wouldn't be too hard to rob an elderly widow. They had heard that she kept upwards of $100,000 in a safe in her home. On March the 8th, 1953, Mabel went out to dinner with her friend, Merle Leslie. That same night, Perkins, Santos, and Barbara had a dinner meeting with two other criminals, Baxter Shorter and John True. Shorter had been recruited for his safe-cracking skills, and he was reluctant to involve a woman. The group planned to break into Mabel's home the following night. Barbara's job would be to lull Mabel into a false sense of security so that the four men could gain entry to the house. Everyone agreed this would be best accomplished by a woman, so that guaranteed Barbara a spot in the group and, of course, a share of the ill-gotten gains. The gang met for dinner at the Smokehouse restaurant the following evening, and this was located just 2 miles from Mabel's home. Once they felt it was dark enough, they got into 2 cars and made their way to the Burbank residence. Barbara went up to the door and rang the bell. There was some tense moments of waiting as they saw lights come on in the property, and eventually the sounds of a muted conversation made their way across on the night air to the waiting men. Mabel had just been relaxing at home and reading a book when Barbara knocked at her door, acting the part of a distressed woman whose vehicle had broken down, and she was asking if she could please use Mabel's phone to call for assistance. Barbara did a convincing enough job to persuade Mabel to open the door, at which point she went into the residence, shortly followed by the rest of the gang. They demanded cash, jewels, and whatever other valuables Mabel had in the residence. But Mabel refused to give them anything. She was then gagged, and it is alleged that Barbara pistol whipped her in the head, causing Mabel to collapse to the floor. The men quickly searched the house, and then John True went outside to where Baxter Shorter was waiting in a car. Baxter was the only one who had not initially followed Barbara into the house. He was there purely as a safecracker. He wasn't getting involved with anything else. True went out to tell Shorter that they had not been able to find a safe, and True and Shorter went back in to the Monaghan home. Shorter was shocked to see Mabel lying bleeding on the ground. He says that he saw Barbara handing a nickel-plated revolver to Perkins, who then began to beat Mabel with it. This had not been part of the plan, and Shorter wanted nothing to do with any of it. He told True to remove the gag because he felt Mabel appeared to be choking on it, and True did this, but Mabel was very badly injured by this point. She had been beaten multiple times about the head. God, I've almost got 2 milkshakes here. I did say this was a lengthy one. After this brief interlude, the men returned to ransacking the house, absolutely frantically ripping it to pieces, trying to find the money and valuables they believed were hidden in the property. While they were searching, Shorter managed to take a utility bill that actually had Mabel's name and address on it, and he planned to use this to make an anonymous call for help once the group had left. He had absolutely no intention of being sentenced to death for murder. As time wore on, it became pretty clear to the gang that this was a fruitless endeavour. The valuables and the cash that they had heard Mabel had were just nowhere to be found, and they decided that they needed to make good their escape. Perkins, Santos and Barbara went in one car, Shorter and True in the other. Shorter actually told True that he was planning to place this anonymous call for help, and True replied that Mabel had been dead when the group left the property. He told Shorter to keep his mouth shut. Shorter was driving. He dropped True off and then drove to the nearest gas station where he placed that 911 call. However, in his haste, he forgot to give the full address of Mabel's property, and this meant that emergency services were unable to locate the residence. It is sadly ironic that the gang learned afterwards that there had in fact been $15,000 worth of jewels and valuables located in a closet very close to where Mabel had died. It was not until 2 days after the robbery that Mabel was actually found. A gardener, Mitchell Truesdale, had called round to collect payment for a job and to do a bit more work on the property. He noticed that the front door was ajar, and this was pretty unusual. He made his way inside and quickly realised that something was wrong. As I said earlier, the gang had ripped the place apart, desperately hunting for non-existent cash. He found Mabel lying in the hall, and the wall was splattered with her blood, as was the floor. A strip torn from a bedsheet had been used to secure her hands behind her back. A pillowcase had been placed over her head, and this was secured around her neck with a second strip torn from the same bedsheet. Her Labrador, Ziggy, was at the back door going absolutely mental. Truesdale ran to a neighbour's house to call the police immediately. It was quickly determined that Mabel's death was not a result of natural causes and was definitely a homicide. Iris, Mabel's daughter, offered a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of her mother's killers. The temptation of this reward money prompted small-time criminal George Allen to get in touch with the chief of the Burbank Police, Rex Andrews, and Allen revealed that 16 months earlier, he had a discussion with 4 other men about the possibility of robbing Mabel Monaghan. They planned to do this while Mabel was away visiting her daughter, but this plan was never seen through. Alan strongly felt that some of the men involved in this initial discussion were probably involved in the eventual crime. On March 26, 1953, 5 men, all known to be career criminals, were arrested and questioned by police. One of these 5, who had been named by Alan, was Baxter Shorter. Although the police were able to establish connections between each of the 5 men and Luther Shearer, Mabel's son-in-law, they didn't have any evidence on which they could hold any of the men. Despite this, the experience was enough to spook Shorter. He felt his best chance of avoiding the gas chamber would be to turn state's evidence. And if he did this before any of the other gang members were arrested, he might manage to avoid the death penalty himself. He told the police that he'd gone along to the house as a lookout and that he had witnessed Perkins hitting Mabel with the gun. At this point, Shorter declined to be taken into protective custody. He was convinced he'd be much safer at home where he knew how to take care of himself. The following evening, Baxter Shorter was kidnapped at gunpoint from his home. His wife, Olivia, was able to identify the kidnappers as Santos and Perkins. The police realised there was very little chance that Shorter was going to be found alive. 64-year-old Mabel had been viciously beaten around the head and face with a blunt instrument. Trails of her blood ran throughout the house. This led police to believe that she had been dragged from room to room and beaten each time she failed to tell the gang where the valuables and money were located. The house had been well and truly torn apart. Even a furnace vent had been ripped out of the floor. Despite all of this destruction, no fingerprint evidence could be found. No other physical evidence could be found. Police were informed by numerous people they interviewed about the rumours that Shearer had this emergency stash of cash in Mabel's home. And they were pretty sure this was the motive for the crime. An inquest was held and Mabel's cause of death was determined as asphyxiation. She had 12 head wounds and her skull had been crushed in 2 places. This was brutal. But it was the strip of bedsheet tied around her neck which finally finished her off. Despite this, the story would be retold many, many times as Mabel having been pistol whipped to death. Either way, it was a horrible way for an elderly woman to spend the last few moments of her life. The information that Shorter had provided to the police allowed them to identify the other 4 members of the gang. Police went to True's home and they spoke with his girlfriend, who informed them that True was actually away, but he would be returning the following day as his friend Jack Santos would be visiting. The following day, officers went to the house to bring in True and Santos. However, they were only able to arrest True because Santos had phoned the house prior to his arrival and spoken with True's girlfriend, who had informed him that some strange men had been asking after him. This caused Santos to drop completely off the grid. Why she didn't alert her boyfriend is anybody's guess. Police also went to the home where Perkins and Graham had shacked up, only to find out that the couple had very recently moved out. The police spent the next 3 weeks hunting for the fugitives. They had a watch on all the roads out, the trains, the bus depots, and the airport. They suspected that the three were still somewhere within the state, and it was only a matter of time before they would be flushed out. This turned out to be the case, and it was Barbara's heroin addiction that finally led to the capture of the 3 remaining gang members. She had bleached her hair blonde and set up a meeting with a dealer. An undercover officer happened to be working narcotics when the meeting was set up, and the police were able to arrange for some female undercover officers to stake out the vicinity of the meeting and to follow Barbara on the bus to the place that she was staying with Santos and Perkins, because they thought female officers would be less suspicious. Before she got on the bus, however, Barbara took a moment to shoot up in the ladies. On Monday, May the 4th, officers raided the shabby flat in Linwood. They were met with little resistance and took the 3 people, Santos, Perkins and Barbara, into custody. They were all charged with murder. J. Miller Levy was leading the prosecution, but he had a problem. The statement that Shorter had given was inadmissible as evidence because Shorter could not be present in court to be questioned, so it would be hearsay. Levy needed to see if he could get one of the other gang members to turn state's evidence and throw the others under the bus. The man he set his sights on for this purpose was John True. True was more than happy to accept the immunity offered in exchange for his testimony. The story he gave was more or less the same as Shorter's, but there were a few extra details which Shorter had not been privy to. True revealed that he had been the second person to enter the Monaghan house, with Barbara being the first, so that meant he had been present for the entirety of the events that took place. His job was to go in after Barbara, and if there were any issues, he was to say that he had managed to get the car started and he and Barbara would leave. So Levy now had a witness who'd been present for almost the entire duration of the crime. The only bit he wasn't there for, pretty much, was when Barbara gained entry to the house, and then briefly when he had been heading out to get Shorter and bring him in. Crucially, True had seen Barbara hitting Mabel with the gun and then handing it to Perkins to continue the assault. Barbara had not been entirely alone in prison. She had befriended a much younger woman named Donna. Donna was a 20-year-old divorcee serving a year in jail for a DUI, and she would have a further 5 probation years to follow once she'd served her jail time. She had been driving a vehicle and involved in a head-on collision with another car driven by a couple. The 51-year-old woman was killed and her husband severely injured. Donna was only 3 months into her sentence when Barbara arrived, and she was pretty fearful of the environment that she found herself in. So when Barbara offered the hand of friendship, Donna was only too happy to accept. I'm going to get a cloth. This has been a lot messier than I anticipated. Barbara was 30 years old when she took Donna under her wing, and when she realised that True had turned against her, she knew the situation was not looking good. Donna revealed to Barbara that she had a friend named Sam, and for a future payment, Sam would testify that he had been with Barbara on the night of Mabel's murder. Sam visited Donna 11 days before the Monaghan trial was scheduled to begin, and Donna arranged for him to visit with Barbara. The pair, Barbara and Sam, had 3 meetings in total, and they used these to establish their story and create the alibi. Sam repeatedly asked Barbara for reassurance that Shorter had been taken care of and was not going to show up as a surprise witness at the trial. Sam did not want to go down for perjury, and Barbara eventually told him she had been with the 4 men on the night of the murder, and with Shorter gone, there was nobody else who could come forward to challenge Sam's version of events. His statement that he had been with Barbara all night in a motel when Mabel was killed. The murder trial began on Friday, August 14th, 1953. Each of the defendants had their own attorney. Perkins and Santo presented as slightly shifty, and True was in a new sports coat and tie. Barbara chose to wear a fitted tan suit and high heels, her hair in a neat French twist, and her nails beautifully manicured. The first order of business was to request that the charges against True be dropped because he was going to be a witness for the prosecution. This was done, and True was escorted from the courtroom. The prosecution then proceeded with their case. The first witness was Mabel's friend, Merle Leslie. She was followed by Mitchell Truesdale, the gardener who had discovered Mabel's body. And then it was the turn of Dr. Frederick Newbar. He was the coroner's surgeon who had performed the autopsy on Mabel. Next to the stand came John True. He testified that the plan was to commit a quick in-and-out robbery, taking money that did not belong to Mabel Monaghan, but to her son-in-law. Nobody was going to be hurt. He described for the court how Barbara talked her way into Mabel's home, and that when he entered, the first thing he saw was Barbara pistol whipping Mabel with a gun. Mabel was crying out for Barbara to stop. He stated that Mabel was bleeding and that Barbara struck her 2 or 3 times before Mabel collapsed to the floor. He said he knelt beside Mabel and Perkins entered the residence. He bound Mabel's hands behind her back. It was Barbara who put the pillowcase over Mabel's head, and Santo secured it around her neck with the second strip of bedsheet. So there we have True indicating each of the other 3 in the process of binding Mabel. They left her moaning, tied up on the floor, and began ransacking the house. True believed they were in the house for maybe about 20 minutes, and that at some point Mabel fell silent, and when they left the home, she was still bleeding through the pillowcase. The defence then took their turn to cross-examine True. True was forced to admit that he had repeatedly lied about his involvement in the crime until he was offered immunity. True said that he was too afraid to just leave the property when the planned burglary escalated into something far more brutal. His testimony against his 3 co-conspirators was pretty damning. Barbara had maintained that she was unable to recollect her whereabouts on the night of the murder, but now she only saw one way out of this situation. She requested a meeting with her attorney and told him that she had suddenly remembered her whereabouts on the night in question. She had spent the entire night in a motel room with a man named Sam, and when Sam visited her in jail, that's when she remembered what had happened between them on that particular night. And she informed her attorney that Sam would confirm this alibi. The next day in court, Sam was called to the stand, and Barbara, who was pretty confident, watched in confusion as Sam was sworn in as a witness for the prosecution. It was revealed that, upon learning about Barbara's friendship with Donna, police had persuaded Donna to aid them in obtaining a confession from Barbara. In return, Donna's jail time would be reduced as she was hardly a hardened criminal. Donna agreed and introduced Barbara to her friend Sam. In reality, Sam was an undercover police officer, and he was wearing a wire the whole time he met with Barbara. All she could do was sit and listen with everyone else in the court as she heard her own voice confessing to the crime and further condemning Perkins and Santo. Donna was released from prison that very same day. Perkins and Santo were both experienced criminals, and they knew there was no way out of this for them. They knew that taking the stand would do absolutely nothing to benefit them. Barbara, however, was desperate. She wasn't ready to give up, and she wanted to take the stand and tell her side of the story. Since the alibi had fallen through, she decided the best plan of action was to return to the original story that she could not recollect where she'd been on the night of the murder. She said that the fact she couldn't remember was the only reason she'd been able to fabricate the false alibi with Sam. She attempted to present herself as a young housewife who, through no fault of her own, just fell into bad company. Unable to prove where she was on the night of the murder, she took a chance on Sam because she felt it was the only chance she had to prove that she was innocent. She explained that she was only in the company of Perkins and Santo when they were arrested because she had heard that police were seeking a female accomplice. Since she was known to associate with them, Barbara feared she would be found in violation of her perjury probation and decided the best thing to do would be to hide out with the men until the heat was off. Levy tore her to shreds when it was his turn to question her. Barbara's attorney did his utmost to salvage things on the redirect, but it was very clear to everyone, including Barbara herself, she had done herself no favours. The trial lasted in total for 5 weeks. The lawyers of Santo and Perkins did their best to try and discredit the testimony of True. They tried to insinuate that it was actually True who had beaten Mabel to death, and he was blaming the others in an attempt to save himself. Barbara's attorney tried to paint her as a woman ruthlessly harassed by undercover police. He suggested that the jury should not trust the word of a man known to be a criminal, a man who exchanged the lives of 3 others for his own. It took less than 5 hours for the jury to return a unanimous verdict. All 3 were guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. 2 weeks later, the judge sentenced Santo, Perkins and Barbara to death by lethal gas. The 2 men were taken by train to death row, and Barbara was taken to a women's prison 30 miles away. And there a special solitary cell had been prepared for her. Appeals were made first to the state Supreme Court, then to the US Supreme Court. But in all cases, the verdicts and sentencing were upheld. The execution date for the 3 was set as June 3rd, 1955. Barbara did give several interviews during the time she was incarcerated between her sentence being passed and carried out. She said, "If I were guilty, I would never admit it and let my children be branded with that stigma all their lives. She also stated that if it is God's will that I die, then I'll die like a lady. Unfortunately for Barbara, that was not going to be the case. At 10 a.m. on June 3rd, 1955, Warden Harley Teets, Father Daniel McAllister, and the execution team came to collect Barbara. She had chosen to wear a champagne-coloured suit, brown button high heels, small gold drop earrings, and a crucifix pendant. A wheelchair had been placed by the holding cell in the event that Barbara became hysterical or too weak to walk. But this was not required. As they were about to leave the holding cell, the phone rang. Governor Knight instructed Teets to delay proceedings due to a legal technicality. Barbara was returned to the cell. At 10:25 a.m, the phone rang again. This time the governor was calling to say that the execution should proceed as planned. The team escorted Barbara to the gas chamber, but just as she was about to enter, the phone rang again. It was the governor issuing a second delay. Barbara was, understandably, growing more and more distressed. Rather than returning her to the holding cell, she was taken to a small office adjacent to the gas chamber and waited there for a further 53 minutes. At 11:18 a.m, you've guessed it, the phone rang. Again, it was the governor, this time to say the execution should go ahead. The final attempts at appeal had failed. It was at 11:34 that Barbara was guided into the execution chamber. A sleep mask was being used as a blindfold because she had just become so distressed with the repeated instructions and delays. She was helped to sit in the chair on the right side of the chamber. 4 officers strapped her ankles, forearms and chest to the chair. The last of these men to leave the chamber patted Barbara on the shoulder and quietly said to her, "Count to 10 after you hear the cyanide tablets drop, and then take a deep breath. It's easier that way." Barbara's response was, "How the hell would you know?" The airtight door was sealed shut and pressure locked. It was a full minute after this that a cheesecloth bag containing 2 golf ball-sized cyanide tablets was lowered into a vat of sulfuric acid beneath the chair on which Barbara was sitting. While the sound this made was very faint, it was enough to startle Barbara and she visibly tensed. A rubber tube was attached to a stethoscope diaphragm and this was taped to Barbara's chest. This was to allow a doctor to listen to her heartbeat from outside the chamber. Barbara was observed to take a deep, deliberate breath. Almost immediately, her head slumped forward. At 11:42 a.m, the doctor pronounced Barbara Graham was dead. Just a couple of hours later, Santo and Perkins would be executed in that same chamber. Barbara's funeral was held 2 days after her execution. She was buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery in a brief service led by Father Daniel McAllister. Her plain grey casket was decorated with a small spray of red roses and pink snapdragons. There have been questions over whether or not Barbara was actually guilty. Several people believed that while she may have been present at the Monaghan house, she was a slight, slender woman not known for violence. And the evidence that she beat Mabel was the word of John True, not exactly a reliable witness. Perkins and Santo chose neither to implicate nor exonerate Barbara. During their time in jail, they were reluctant to discuss her at all. There is no doubt that Barbara suffered and horrific death. The multiple delays turned her calm, prepared demeanour into one of despair and distress. I've not gone into great detail about her actual final moments. Suffice to say, the gas chamber was not a painless or peaceful means of execution. I will leave you with the image of Mabel, one person who certainly was innocent in all of this. She too died a painful and terrifying death. She was not guilty of any crime. She simply had the misfortune to be the subject of popular unfounded rumours. Her death was caused by the greed of a group of people who saw her as a way to gain easy money. Thank you for staying with me for this very long video. I hope that you have found this informative and interesting, and that you will come back for the next one. But until then, take care.